Center for Diversity Leadership, where we are supporting school leaders together across the nation as they create school cultures that ensure all students are seen, valued, celebrated, and heard. I am Dr. Ryan Daniel, and I am your fellow in this work. All right, friends, today we have a special guest, Dr. William Blake. Dr. Blake is the Director of Redesign in District of Columbia Public Schools, and I am going to turn the mic over to Dr. Blake because I would love for Dr. Blake to introduce himself to our listeners. What's up, Dr. Blake?
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're at. But thank you, Dr. Daniel. My name is Dr. William Blake. As she's mentioned, I'm over here doing some amazing work in District of Columbia Public Schools, where I have the privilege to reimagine and rethink high schools. We are disrupting what traditional schooling looks like, and we are bringing an innovative approach to this. Prior to this work, my resume looks just like yours. I've been a classroom teacher, I've been an assistant principal, and I had the amazing opportunity of serving as a school leader at 2 campuses, a middle school and a high school. So now I just bring all those experiences together to kind of disrupt what traditional schooling has looked like over these past hundreds of years.
I told you all we're going to have some fun today. So today we're going to be talking about biases. You know, like, which students are your teachers watching? Biases are inherited and natural attributes that all humans possess, reinforced by everyday interactions and the media. Implicit bias is an unconscious and involuntary prejudice against a thing, a person, or a group. Listen, all of us have biases. They form through everyday interactions and exposure to media. Today, we're going to try to talk about how we can discover our own implicit biases, cultivating empathy for each other, especially those of us experiencing disparities, can help reduce negative biases. And if you didn't know, there are 3 types of biases. There's racial bias, there's age biases, and there's gender biases. So today, we're going to talk with Dr. Blake on how we as leaders can really be intentional, about helping our staff understand their biases and its impact on students. So before we get into it, Dr. Blake, we're really transparent here, but have you ever experienced a quick little elevator story of one of the types of biases, whether it'd be racial bias, age bias, or gender bias?
Absolutely. So for those of you all who might not know me, so I became a leader very young. I became an assistant principal at the age of 25, and I became a principal at the age of 29. With that, I have experienced a lot of age bias. I tried to become a principal. I'll never forget it, during my second year after being an AP at 27. And the response that I got from someone who interviewed me said, "You are not ready yet because you are not old enough to be a school leader." And that was at 27 years old. So I have experienced that, and that experience has stayed with me for a very, very long time. And I always felt that I had to work harder than the next person who was 5 and 10 and 8 years older than me, just to get to the level that I wanted to get to. So unfortunately, I had experienced that age bias in my work, in my pursuit to becoming a school leader.
Because I think oftentimes we feel like bias is only like racial, like it's only your culture. But I agree with you, just very similar to you, Dr. Blake, coming into leadership very young. But then for me, I am a Black woman. So I have racial bias, I have gender bias, and then being a young leader, trying to disrupt, what people's just mindsets are around the picture of who should be a leader. And I know for me, that has been something that I'm always just kind of mindful about when I have interactions, with my teachers and my staff. So what do you think is the connection between unconscious biases and maybe microaggressions?
Absolutely. So when I think about unconscious biases, those unconscious biases are those biases that you develop through your social environments, those biases that you develop through your family environments, and those biases that you develop that you now see in the media each and every day, right? So for an example, for those of us, that grew up in a household where our family might be very, very large, an unconscious bias that you might have grew up with is that, you know what? I'm used to being around lots of people, and I'm used to everyone being loud, right? So if I go into another space where everyone is loud, I'm automatically going to assume that they might come from a very large family, right? So everybody shows up in their biases every day, but you have to be very, very intentional to be aware of your biases, right? So when those unconscious biases show up, if I'm in a room of people who do not look like me and do not sound like me, I don't want to bring those stereotypes that I learned and I acquired in my youthfulness or in my comings and goings in society. I don't want those to show up in the space that I'm in. So I want to be very, very aware to get to know the people that are in the room who do not look like me or do not sound like me or who might be different from me. Those microaggressions, now that's when I say things are very overt and they are very purposeful and intentional, right? For an example, Dr. Daniel, both of us have our doctorate degrees, right? If we are in a room, I'm going to share my experience. I have been in a room of people who are not my peers, where they might be Caucasian colleagues, and I am introduced as Dr. William Blake. And after I'm introduced as Dr. William Blake, I have been in a room where my white counterparts have called me Mr. Blake over and over and over again. That is a microaggression right there, right? Because society says, well, if you have a doctorate degree, people believe that you are better than them. Mm-hmm. That's not true. We work very hard to get to what we earned and what we acquired. So we should be called what our title allows us to be called. However, when people continue to call me Mr. Blake over and over again, when my title was Dr. Blake, that is a microaggression that folks displaying, and they are intentional about it. So those microaggressions come about when people just want to be intentional to not respect the title in the room, the space in the room, or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's like we have lived the same life because I have experienced the same thing. And I remember when I first got my doctorate, that a teacher, and she was a Caucasian teacher, and I actually experienced this with the older Hispanic teacher as well. That she said, oh, well, it's going to take me a long time to start calling you Dr. Daniel. So I'll just say Mrs. Daniel. And I said, no, please address me as such. And I know that one day, one pre-service week, I thought of that moment. And so I started off, and this is when you are writing down something, listeners. But I did this kind of check-in with my staff of, how do you professionally want to be addressed, and how do you personally want to be addressed? And when can we address you? When should we address you as this personally or professionally? And, I had a few people come up to me and say, wow, thank you for doing that check-in, because, in education, we'll constantly call people by their last name, hey, Blake, hey, Daniel. And I did not realize that there were some people that they did not like that. They wanted to be addressed as Mr. or Mrs. or Miss or Doctor. And I think that a lot of times, I love what you said, that microaggressions, those when you are intentionally doing something that makes a person feel a certain way, but that those unconscious biases are something that you just sometimes, it's innate, you grow. It depends on your environment. I know for me, I come from a church background, and I come from having, seniors, citizens in my house that were raising me. So when I think of respect, I don't care if I'm the principal. If I have a teacher that is the same age as my grandmother, the same age as my mother, like I respect what they bring to the table. And though they're like, no, it's whatever you say. Like, no, I honor that
Right.
you have walked the life that I haven't gone to yet. I'm not there in my life. So how can principals, because, we got principals listening, aspiring principals, assistant principals, how can we, help our staff understand their biases and its impact on students?
Yeah, the first thing is we have to create the space, and you got to create the space for people to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right?
Yes.
And the way that you can create that space, because I always believe in giving strategy, right? As a school leader, the way that you can create that space, you always use data as a narrative, right? Always use data as a narrative. I don't care what school community you work at. If you put data at the forefront, you are going to see some disproportionality in that data. Rather, it's around Black kids and white kids, Black boys and white boys, Hispanic boys, and so forth. You're going to see a disproportionality in that data. Yep. Put that data up. What do you notice about the data? Right? And when you ask the question, what do you notice? Ask them, what biases do you have about that data? And that's where that uncomfortableness comes from, right? So the first piece is you have to create the space for people to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And second thing is we have to create opportunities to build folks' capacity around their self-awareness. Yeah. When you think about social emotional learning, one of the 5 core competencies in social emotional learning is self-awareness. And when you are aware, you are able to identify the biases that you bring into the room. So as a school leader, either we have to do the hard work to build our capacity to allow folks to become self-aware, or reach out to our central office partners or our external partners to bring in PD resources for folks to be aware. So my 2 strategies is create the space and use data as a narrative, and also build folks' capacity around their self-awareness using the social emotional learning competency.
Yeah. As we wrap up this, I think of just how real time this conversation is for me. And just yesterday, I had one of my veteran teachers come in and have a conversation with me. And it's one that I'm really building a relationship with because, she has been here for a long time. So I'm really valuing her and making sure that she feels seen and valued. And so she shared with me that, my Filipino teachers were not feeling as connected to me. They didn't feel that I was giving them as much opportunities this school year. And because I'm such an empath, right? I talked about like empathetic leadership skills. I truly it paused me. I'm like, man, I want to make sure that I haven't been unintentional about making space and creating the space and the opportunities for them. But now I got to be intentional about how I show up for them and make sure that they feel seen and valued, especially because I came in with the bias, because now I'm in my second school, and this is the first time that I have had a high number of Filipino teachers that, are very different from me. And so I have tried to be intentional about learning more about, this particular group of my staff members and how I can support them, how I can make sure that they feel valued. And I don't let any bias that I may have get in the way of my support for them. So, I really appreciate some of the different conversations that we had today, just about how we can really cultivate empathy, for each other, and making sure that our implicit biases, don't get in the way and hinder us for, how we support and show up for our school community. So, Dr. Blake, any last tips that you want to share with our listeners as they, they really dive into this work?
Yeah, absolutely. The first piece is I just want everyone to know it's okay to not be okay, right? And what I mean by that is people walk and show up in their bias every single day. But when you are able to identify and be aware of your bias, it's okay for you to make different pivots and make adjustments in the spaces that you occupy. And it's also okay to be vulnerable and transparent. As a school leader, you could say, you know what? I showed up in this space thinking this way, but after engaging and communicating, I am leaving the space feeling this way, right? So I just want to lead with that, you know, when you talk about this work, you have to have lots of empathy, not only for others, but you also have to have lots of empathy for yourself, right? Because you cannot judge yourself for being raised in the communities and the environments that you were raised in, which help you develop your biases. It's just up to you just to communicate those, be very, very aware of those, and create the space to be vulnerable and transparent to learn a different perspective when those biases show up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blake. It has been great talking to you and just giving our members just some tips. You know, everyone listen up. It is not about changing the bias or stopping the bias. It's about getting in between your internal reaction and your external reaction. Today, we hope you walked away with just a different outlook, a different mindset, you know, something that you can go back to your school community and just look at a little differently. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for more podcasts from the Center for Diversity Leadership.